Hello, everybody. The day is Tuesday, May 27th, 2025, and there's expected to be more severe weather today. It's expected to be a mostly hail and wind threat with the threat of a tornado or two. All right, here's the SPC outlook for today. So, as you can see, we have a slight risk here in southwestern Texas, which includes San Antonio and Midland. And then over here, we have a slight, which spans from Louisiana to eastern Georgia. And then we have a marginal, which includes Denver and goes all the way down to the Texas-Mexico border. And then back over here, we have another marginal that goes from Louisiana all the way to the eastern coast. These risks are mostly fueled by the threat of wind. You can see that there's a 15% chance of wind in our southwestern Texas risk area. And then in our Louisiana to Georgia area, there's also another 15%. And then for hail, we have a hatched 15% in southwestern Texas. This could be large to very large hail, which has kind of been following our pattern we've seen for the past couple of days. For the past 2 days, there's been up to 5 to 6 inch hail in this area. So yeah, definitely something to look out for today. And then for a tornado risk, which is the smallest risk of our threats today, we have a 2% in our southwestern Texas area and then another 2% down here. Onto our day 2 outlook, we have a large marginal risk all the way to New Mexico and Colorado, with 2 slights highlighted right here in our Texas Panhandle and in far western Texas. These are once again going to be mostly wind and hail threats, with a 15% risk of wind in the Texas Panhandle and a 5% that expands pretty much our entire risk area. And then we have two 15% in far western Texas and the Texas Panhandle for hail. And then we have 2 very small 2% tornado risk. Again, nothing really to worry about here, but just something to keep in mind. For our day 3, severe weather continues. So in our Gulf states, we have a small marginal risk. And then back here in the risk area that we've seen highlighted again and again over the past week, we have another marginal. And then for day 4, the SPC has actually highlighted a 15% spanning from eastern Georgia, eastern South Carolina, and eastern North Carolina. And looking into the long term, this is going to be our driver of that day 4 15%. As we go into day 4 Friday, we see our jet kind of really ramp up in this area. And that's going to be the reason for that 15% over there on the East Coast. And looking farther into the long term, in June, we see a pretty favorable pattern for severe weather sort of evolve. We see a big jet with southwesterly flow spanning across our classic tornado alley, which could cause some severe weather then. We see quite a bit of clearing up in front of our squall over here in Mississippi, Alabama, and we see pretty clear skies over here in our Texas risk area. In fact, we already see signs of storms down here. So clouds would not be a limiting factor today. Okay, so let's look at some model data. So over here, we can see our QOCS squall sort of moving eastward. And then down here in Texas, we're going to want to look for that storm initiation. As we go into afternoon hours, we'll see it sort of bubble up. And immediately, we'll notice that there is some discrete nature at the start, like there has been with our storms this week, but pretty quickly, it'll just turn into a messy system with not much potential of producing tornadoes at all. And yeah, this is when the wind threat will really ramp up. But at the beginning here, there's definitely a threat of hail. The threat of hail is going to be more up here in the U.S., with the biggest threat of hail and tornadoes was during the start is actually going to be down here in Mexico. But up here for our squall in eastern Alabama, this is when it enters that most favorable shear environment. So that's definitely something to look out for early afternoon, mid afternoon. Okay, so our dew points, immediately we can see plenty of moisture out here to keep our storms going. Not as much moisture as there has been the past couple of days, but definitely enough to feel storms. Whenever we see over 64, anything over 64 dew point, that's definitely enough for storms. And as we see, we have a decently weak dry line back here, which is going to be the initiating boundary. There is a boundary draped across this area in Texas. So our biggest chance of seeing any tornadoes or any storms that can kind of take advantage of that boundary, that's where the most low level shear is going to be today. But in a minute, I'll show you that there's really not much low level shear to begin with to sort of feel that threat. Here is our cape versus shear, and immediately the first thing we notice, there is not loads of storm fuel that there has been out there the past couple of days, really maximizing around 3000 cape, which is certainly enough to feel storms, but that could lower the wind and hail threat out there today. That's why we're not seeing 30% risk, and that's why we're only seeing 15%. And as we can see, our shear vectors are actually pretty parallel to our initiating line. So that's why the storms start out fairly discrete, but our boundary, which is draped over here, the shear vectors are not parallel to that, obviously. So that's why we could kind of see that congealing of storms later on. And then this is our SRH model. So basically, this predicts the amount of spin in the atmosphere. And as we can see, there is not much of it. Yeah, there's not much of it at all. Over here, this spin is actually, this is predicting the spin of the storms itself and not the environment that they're going into. And as we can see, the environment in front of these storms, there's not much, if any, spin in the air. So that's why we're not really seeing much of a tornado threat today. Okay, let's look at some weather soundings. This is from our southwestern Texas risk area, and what we immediately notice is that there is basically no low level shear. So very, very little shear in the first 1 to 2 kilometers of the atmosphere. What that means, these storms are going to be messy and high precipitation, so there's not going to be loads of clearing. But what we do notice is that in the upper levels, there's actually a decent amount of shear. So what this means is that these storms could sustain for a while. Their updrafts will continue to rotate, but in the lower levels, there is very low shear. So that's kind of the reason why our tornado threat is so low. If we look at our thermodynamics, they're actually pretty okay today. So over here, we have pretty steep lapse rates. That's going to help with lift for the storms. And then we see that we have a pretty saturated atmosphere with 66 dew points. That's definitely enough to make these storms grow and initiate. There's almost no capping today. So these storms will probably just explode. And then one thing we do notice is that we have quite a bit of precipitable water. So that's why we're likely to see just high precipitation, sort of messy storms today. And that's also another cause for our large hail threat. And this is a sounding in front of our squall line over in Alabama. And immediately we notice pretty good low level shear, actually. And another thing we see is that there's pretty solid helicity in the atmosphere. Anything over 100 is enough. So 200, that's actually really good. And this is the main reason why we're expecting to see more tornadoes out of our squall instead of our southwestern Texas tornado threat today. Okay, here's our flood outlook. So getting loads of rain day after day. And yeah, over in Alabama, we're definitely going to see a flood risk evolve along with in southwestern Texas. And this is our temperature outlook. We're expecting to see actually sort of a cool down all the way up to New England. And of course, this includes everywhere but Florida. And another thing is, we're actually expecting to see warmer than usual temperatures in the Midwest, so Minnesota and Wisconsin. And then precipitation, this is expected to actually have below average as that trough sort of digs in. And then Florida and the Southwest, the Four Corner states, are expected to see above average precipitation. And that's actually going to help loads because these areas right now are currently in a pretty significant drought. Florida has been recovering pretty well because of the rain they've gotten over the past couple of weeks. But the Southwest needs help, and it looks like that's going to come with our rain.